Starting next month, Eleanor will be moving to a nursing home, my daughter-in-law Jessica said, raising her glass like she was making a cheerful announcement instead of rewriting my life, and for a moment, no one spoke, not even my son Daniel, who sat beside her nodding as if this had all been decided long ago, as if I had somehow agreed to it without remembering. And I remember noticing the way the sunlight came through the restaurant windows, catching the edge of the silverware and the rim of my untouched coffee cup. Everything looked warm, inviting, normal, and yet the words hung in the air like something misplaced, something that didn't belong. I felt every eye at the table shift toward me, waiting for a reaction, a protest, maybe even tears, but I gave them none. I simply adjusted the napkin on my lap and offered a small polite smile, the kind I had perfected over decades of being the steady one, the one who didn't make scenes, the one who kept the peace even when peace came at a cost. Jessica continued speaking, her voice soft but firm, explaining how they had found a lovely facility, just 20 minutes away, with walking paths and organized activities and nurses on call. She described it like a resort brochure, like she was offering me a gift instead of removing me from my own life. Daniel added something about how it would be safer for me, how the house was too much for someone my age. And I nodded again, slowly, thoughtfully, as if I were considering their words instead of remembering every quiet moment that had led to this one, because this hadn't started today. It had been building for months, maybe longer, small things at first, things easy to dismiss if you wanted to believe your family still saw you the same way, like the day Jessica suggested I move my things out of the upstairs bedroom because the stairs might be dangerous, or when Daniel started handling the mail before I even saw it, casually mentioning bills that had already been paid, decisions already made, conversations I hadn't been part of, and I told myself it was care, concern, love expressed in practical ways. I told myself that families change and roles shift and that maybe this was just what getting older looked like. But sitting there at that table, listening to my future being outlined between bites of eggs and toast, I understood something I had been avoiding. This wasn't about helping me, this was about replacing me, about making space for a version of the family where I no longer had a place at the center. And the strangest part was how calm I felt, not angry, not even hurt in the way I might have expected, just clear, as if a fog had finally lifted and I could see the shape of things exactly as they were. Jessica reached across the table then, placing her hand lightly over mine, her touch gentle, rehearsed. "We just want what's best for you," she said, and I looked down at her perfectly manicured nails, the expensive watch on her wrist, the subtle confidence in her posture, and I realized she truly believed that. Or at least she believed she was entitled to decide it. And I thought about the house, the one they were so eager to free me from, the one Daniel had grown up in, where every wall held a memory, where every corner carried the quiet weight of years lived fully. And I let my fingers rest under hers for a moment longer before slowly pulling my hand back, lifting my coffee cup, taking a small sip even though it had already gone cold, and I said nothing, because what I had learned recently, what I had confirmed in a quiet office with a polite man behind a desk who had looked at me with something like respect instead of pity, was that the story they were telling themselves about that house, about ownership and control and what would happen next, was not the story written in ink. And I watched as Jessica slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me, smiling as if she were presenting a solution, a tidy ending to a problem they had already solved. And I placed my cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the saucer the way I always did. A small habit, a small act of order in a moment that had been designed to take that from me. And for the first time since she had spoken, I met my son's eyes, really looked at him, searching for something familiar, something that might still recognize me not as a responsibility but as his mother. And what I saw there was hesitation, brief and flickering, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet agreement he had worn all morning. And I understood then that whatever came next, whatever this moment became, it would not be decided by them, not entirely. And I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that keeps its meaning close. Because if they believed they were the ones making the final arrangements, if they believed this brunch was the beginning of my exit, then they had already misunderstood something fundamental. And I had learned long ago that the most powerful responses are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they begin with silence, with observation, with the simple act of letting others reveal exactly who they are. And as the conversation around the table resumed, lighter now that the announcement had been made, as if a difficult task had been completed, I sat back in my chair and Listened, my expression calm, my posture relaxed, and I let them talk, I let them plan. Because I knew something they didn't, something that would change the direction of everything they thought was certain, and for now, that knowledge was enough. The rest of the brunch passed in a blur of polite conversation clinking silverware, but I noticed everything. The way Jessica kept glancing at Daniel as if waiting for him to reinforce what she had said, the way he avoided looking at me directly, focusing instead on his plate, cutting his food into small precise pieces as though concentration might excuse silence, and I sat there listening, not to what they were saying but to what they were no longer trying to hide, because once a decision like that is spoken out loud, something shifts, the careful layers fall away, and what remains is the truth they had been rehearsing behind closed doors, and I could almost hear it now in the pauses between their words, in the ease with which they discussed timelines and arrangements as if I were not sitting right there, as if I had already been moved out of the picture in every way that mattered, and I let my gaze drift across the restaurant, taking in the soft murmur of other families enjoying their Sunday morning, the smell of coffee and fresh bread, the quiet laughter from a table nearby, and I thought about how ordinary everything looked, how nothing in that room suggested that a life was being quietly rearranged at a corner table by people who believed they were being reasonable, even kind, and I finished my coffee slowly, placing the cup back on the saucer with the same care I had used all my life, because habits like that do not disappear just because someone decides you are no longer capable, and when the check arrived Daniel reached for it. Automatically, a small gesture that might have seemed thoughtful to anyone else. But I noticed how Jessica smiled approvingly, how it fit into the narrative they were building, one where I was no longer the one in control, and I said nothing, simply folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate, because there are moments when speaking only diminishes what you already understand, and as we stood to leave Jessica slipped her arm through Daniel's, guiding him slightly ahead of me toward the door. A subtle positioning that would have gone unnoticed once, but not now, not after everything had become so clear. And I followed a few steps behind, my pace steady, my posture upright, the way I had carried myself for decades, and when we stepped outside the air was cool, carrying that early afternoon light that makes everything seem sharper, more defined, and Jessica turned to me with that same composed smile, already moving to the next part of her plan, explaining that she would send me the details of the facility later that day, that we could schedule a visit sometime this week, that it would all be very smooth, and I nodded again. Because smooth transitions are easier when the person being moved does not resist, and that is what they were counting on, that I would accept this quietly, gracefully, the way I had accepted so many small changes before, but what they did not know, what they could not see in my calm expression or measured responses, was that 2 nights earlier I had been sitting in my living room long after they had gone to bed, the house quiet in that familiar way that used to comfort me, when I heard their voices from the kitchen, low at first, then clearer as I moved closer, not out of suspicion but out of something I could not quite name at the time, and I had paused just beyond the doorway, not intending to listen but unable to step away once the words reached me, Jessica's voice confident, certain, explaining how the house could be renovated, how much it might be worth once it was updated, Daniel asking practical questions about timing, about whether they should list it immediately or wait until the market shifted, and then the part that settled everything into place. The assumption spoken so easily it might have been fact, that once I was settled somewhere else, the house would naturally become theirs to manage, to sell, to reshape into whatever future they had already imagined, and I remember standing there in the dim light, my hand resting lightly against the wall, not feeling shocked the way one might expect, but something steadier, something that felt like recognition, as if I had finally been given the missing piece to a puzzle I had been assembling without realizing it, and I had returned to my room quietly that night, closing the door with the same care I had used my entire life, and the next morning I had done something I had not done in years. I had taken out the folder where the important documents were kept, the ones my late husband had always insisted be organized, labeled, protected, and I had read through them slowly, line by line, not rushing, not assuming, just confirming what I already suspected might be there, and later that day I had driven to the bank, a short 15-minute drive along streets I knew well, the kind of drive that usually passed without thought but felt different that morning, more deliberate, more focused, and I had sat across from a man who spoke in careful, measured tones, explaining what the documents meant, what they confirmed, and what they did not, and when I left that office I was no longer uncertain, no longer guessing, I knew exactly where I stood, and now, standing on the sidewalk outside that restaurant with Jessica, outlining her plans and Daniel nodding beside her, I understood something else just as clearly. They believed this was the beginning of the end for me, a transition already decided, already in motion. But for me, this was something entirely different. This was the moment everything had aligned, the moment when silence was no longer just restraint but strategy. And as Jessica finished speaking, I looked at her, really looked at her, at the confidence in her eyes, the certainty in her posture, and I offered another small, composed smile, the same one I had worn at the table, the same one that revealed nothing and contained everything, and I said, "That sounds like something we can discuss," my voice steady, calm, giving them exactly what they expected, and nothing more, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to believe they are in control, right up until the moment they realize they are not. That afternoon the house felt quieter than usual, not empty but watchful, as if the walls themselves had heard what was said at brunch and were waiting to see what I would do next, and I moved through it slowly, deliberately, setting my purse down on the same table it had rested on for years, running my fingers lightly along the polished wood as I passed, grounding myself in something familiar, something unchanged, because that is what they had underestimated, not my age, not my silence, but my memory, my awareness of every detail that had built this life piece by piece. And I went into the kitchen where the afternoon light fell across the counters in long golden lines, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, where Daniel had once sat doing his homework at the table, where laughter used to fill the space without effort, and I stood there for a moment, not lost in nostalgia but measuring the distance between what this house had been and what they believed it had become. Just an asset, a piece of property waiting to be converted into something more useful to them, and I opened the drawer where I kept my reading glasses, slipping them on as I walked back into the living room, the folder already waiting on the coffee table exactly where I had left it, neat, organized, unassuming, the way important things often are, and I sat down carefully, smoothing my skirt before opening it again, even though I already knew what was inside, because repetition has a way of settling certainty into place, and I read through the documents once more, the deed, the trust, the signatures, the dates, each line confirming what the man at the bank had explained with quiet professionalism, that the house, this house, the one Jessica spoke about so casually, was not something Daniel could decide the fate of, not something that could be sold or transferred without my consent, because it was mine, placed in my name years ago in a decision that had seemed almost unnecessary at the time, a precaution my husband had insisted on with a gentle firmness I had not fully understood until now, and I remembered that day clearly, sitting at the same table, signing papers while he explained that it was simply a matter of clarity, of ensuring that everything remained secure no matter what happened, and I had trusted him, not questioning the details, because that was how our marriage had worked, a quiet partnership built on mutual respect, and now, years later, that quiet decision had become something else entirely, something protective, something powerful, and I closed the folder slowly, placing my hand over it for a moment as if acknowledging the weight of what it represented, not just ownership, but agency, and I leaned back into the couch, letting my gaze drift toward the window where the light was beginning to soften, the afternoon moving steadily toward evening, and I thought about Daniel, about the boy he had been, the way he used to run through this house without hesitation, calling out for me, trusting that I would always be there, and I wondered when that certainty had changed, when I had become someone he discussed rather than someone he listened to, and I did not let the thought linger too long, because understanding does not require dwelling. It requires clarity, and I had that now, more than I had in years, and I stood up, carrying the folder with me to the desk in the corner, opening the drawer where I kept the rest of the important papers, placing it carefully inside before locking it, the small click of the lock sounding louder than it should have, final in a way that felt appropriate, and then I picked up my phone, not hesitating, not second-guessing, dialing a number I had already saved earlier that day, and when the man from the bank answered I spoke calmly, confirming the next steps, asking the questions that needed to be asked, listening as he explained the process in the same steady tone he had used before, and I took notes, precise, organized, writing each detail down in my own handwriting, because this was not something to be left to memory alone, this was something to be documented, to be understood fully, and when the call ended I set the phone down gently, looking at the notes for a moment before closing the notebook, feeling that same quiet sense of control settle over me again. And later that evening when Daniel and Jessica returned home, their voices carrying through the hallway before they even saw me, I remained in the living room, seated in the same place, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, and they entered together, Jessica speaking first, continuing the conversation from earlier as if it had never paused, mentioning appointment times, brochures, small logistical details that assumed my agreement, and I listened, nodding occasionally, offering simple responses that gave them no reason to question the narrative they had constructed, because sometimes the easiest way to see how far someone will go is to give them no resistance at all, and Daniel glanced at me once, briefly, as if searching for something, perhaps hesitation, perhaps acceptance, and I met his gaze calmly, offering nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement, and Jessica smiled, satisfied, already moving ahead in her plans, and I realized then that they were not prepared for anything outside of what they expected. They had rehearsed this outcome so thoroughly that any deviation would feel like a disruption, and I intended to let that disruption come at the exact moment it would matter most, not before, not prematurely, but when their certainty was at its peak. And as the evening settled around us, as they moved through the house discussing changes that had not yet happened, I sat there listening, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my thoughts clear, my decision already made, because they believed they were guiding me toward an ending, but what they did not understand was that I had already stepped into something else entirely, something they could not see yet, something that would not be announced over brunch or discussed in careful tones, something that would reveal itself only when there was no longer any room for misunderstanding, and until that moment arrived, I would remain exactly as they expected, quiet, composed, and watching. The next morning began the same way all my mornings had begun for years, with quiet, with routine, with the soft hum of a house that still belonged to me even if others had started to speak as if it did not, and I woke before the sun fully rose, as I always did, sitting up slowly at the edge of my bed, letting my feet rest on the cool wooden floor, grounding myself in something real before the day tried to reshape itself around me again, and I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and slacks, not because anyone would notice but because I had always believed that how you present yourself to the world should never be dictated by how the world chooses to treat you. And when I stepped into the hallway I could hear faint movement downstairs, the sound of cabinets opening, Jessica already awake, already moving through the kitchen with that efficient rhythm she had developed over the years. A rhythm that once blended into the household but now felt like it was replacing something that had once been mine, and I descended the stairs without rushing, my hand resting lightly on the banister, taking in each step as I always had, because there is a difference between moving through a space and being removed from it, and I intended to remain fully present in every inch of this house. And when I entered the kitchen Jessica glanced up briefly, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, almost rehearsed, and I returned the greeting just as evenly, moving toward the coffee maker, preparing my cup the same way I always had, measuring, pouring, waiting, small actions that required no permission, no approval. And Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his tie already in place, his expression slightly tense as if he had been thinking about something he could not quite resolve, and for a moment the three of us stood there in that shared space, performing the roles we had all learned, Jessica discussing her plans for the day, Daniel responding with brief acknowledgments, and me listening, participating just enough to maintain the appearance of normalcy, because normalcy can be a powerful disguise, and I had no intention of disrupting it before I was ready. And as I stirred my coffee I noticed a folder on the counter, one I had not seen before. Its edges crisp, its placement deliberate, and Jessica reached for it almost immediately, opening it as she began to speak, explaining that she had gathered some information about the facility they had mentioned, brochures, pricing details, timelines, everything organized neatly as if preparation alone could justify the decision, and she slid one of the papers slightly toward me, not fully offering it, just enough to suggest that I should look, and I did. Briefly, my eyes scanning the printed words without truly reading them, because I already understood what they represented, not care, not concern, but a plan moving forward with or without my agreement, and I placed my hand lightly over the paper, steadying it before sliding it back toward her. "It looks very thorough," I said, my voice calm, measured, giving her exactly what she expected, and she smiled again, more confidently this time, interpreting my composure as compliance, and Daniel nodded, relieved perhaps that there was no conflict, no resistance, just the quiet continuation of what they had set in motion, and I finished my coffee, setting the cup down with care before excusing myself, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple movement away from the conversation, because sometimes stepping back is not retreat, it is positioning, and I went into the study, closing the door behind me with a soft click, the room immediately settling into a different kind of silence, one that belonged entirely to me, and I sat at the desk, opening the drawer where I had placed my documents the night before, taking out the folder and laying it flat in front of me, and I ran my fingers lightly over its surface, not out of hesitation but out of recognition, because this was the point where awareness became action, where understanding required response, and I opened it again, reviewing the contents not because I doubted them but because clarity is strengthened through repetition, and I reached for my phone, dialing the number I had written down, the attorney the bank manager had recommended, and when he answered I introduced myself calmly, explaining my situation in straightforward terms, not embellishing, not dramatizing, just presenting the facts as they were, and he listened, asking precise questions, confirming details, and I responded with equal precision, because this was not a conversation driven by emotion, it was one driven by information, by structure, by the kind of clarity that leaves no room for assumption, and by the time the call ended we had arranged a meeting, later that week, a step that felt both simple and significant, and I set the phone down gently, closing the folder once more, and for a moment I allowed myself to sit there in the quiet, feeling not triumph, not satisfaction, but steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, and I returned the folder to the drawer, locking it again before standing, smoothing my blouse, adjusting my posture, because whatever came next would require the same composure I had maintained all along. And when I stepped back into the hallway I could hear Jessica on the phone, her voice lowered but still carrying enough for me to catch fragments, discussing schedules, mentioning timelines, speaking as if everything was already decided, and I paused for just a moment, not to listen but to acknowledge the contrast. Her certainty built on assumption, mine built on fact, and I continued down the hall, moving through the house with the same calm presence I had always carried, because nothing about me had changed, only what I understood. And that understanding was enough to shift everything, even if they had not realized it yet. The following day unfolded with a quiet precision that I had not felt in a long time, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had, and that difference settled into every movement, every glance, every word that passed between us, and I noticed how Jessica continued to move forward with her plans as if momentum alone would carry them to completion, how she left pamphlets on the dining table, how she mentioned appointment times casually over breakfast, how she framed each step as something already agreed upon, and I allowed it, not correcting her, not interrupting, simply observing the shape of her confidence as it grew, because confidence built on assumption has a way of revealing itself when tested, and I was beginning to see exactly where those points of pressure would be, and later that morning, after Daniel had left for work and the house had settled into that familiar midweek quiet, I heard the doorbell ring, a single clear sound that echoed slightly through the hallway, and I walked to answer it without urgency, opening the door to find a young woman standing there, someone I recognized immediately though I had not seen her in some time, Emily, my granddaughter, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, her presence unexpected but not unwelcome, and she smiled when she saw me, a genuine smile that carried none of the careful politeness I had grown accustomed to. "Grandma," she said, stepping forward to embrace me, and I returned the hug, feeling something steady and uncomplicated in that moment. Something that reminded me of how relationships can exist without negotiation or agenda, and I invited her inside, leading her to the living room where she sat down, looking around as if taking in the house with fresh eyes. "I heard about the brunch," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful, and I took a seat across from her, my hands resting lightly in my lap. "People talk," I replied, not dismissing her concern but not feeding it either, and she studied me for a second, as if trying to understand something beneath the surface. "Is it true?" she asked, and I considered the question carefully, not because I did not know the answer, but because answers have layers, and not all of them need to be revealed at once. "They have made a plan," I said finally, my tone even, and she frowned slightly, leaning forward. "But that house is yours," she said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised me, and I looked at her more closely then, noticing the way she held my gaze, the way she did not hesitate, and I felt a small shift inside me, a recognition that she saw something the others had overlooked. "What makes you say that?" I asked, and she hesitated for just a second before answering. "Grandpa told me once," she said, her voice softer now. "He said he made sure everything was in your name, that no one could take it from you," and I felt that same quiet steadiness settle again, not because this was new information, but because hearing it from her confirmed something beyond documents and signatures. It confirmed intent, legacy. The quiet decisions made long ago that were now unfolding exactly as they were meant to. And I nodded slowly. Your grandfather was a careful man, I said, and she let out a small breath, as if releasing something she had been holding. Then why are they acting like this? She asked, and I did not answer immediately, because some questions are not about information, they are about understanding, and understanding takes time. Sometimes people move forward with what they believe is true, I said finally, even when it is not, and she sat back, absorbing that, her expression shifting from confusion to something more resolved. And I could see the moment when she decided something for herself, though she did not say it out loud, and we sat there in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the kind that does not require filling, and then she smiled again, lighter this time. Well, she said, I am glad you are still here, and I returned the smile. So am I replied, and when she left later that afternoon, the house felt different again, not quieter, not heavier, but steadier, as if something had been reaffirmed in a way that did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. And when Jessica returned home later, her movements carrying the same sense of purpose as before, I noticed how she glanced at the living room, perhaps expecting to find me where she had left me, perhaps expecting continuity, and I remained exactly that, composed, present, unchanged in ways that mattered, and she began speaking again about arrangements, about timing, about how quickly everything could be finalized, and I listened, offering the same calm responses, the same measured nods, because now I understood something even more clearly. This was no longer just about what they planned to do, it was about how far they would go before realizing they had built their plans on something that did not belong to them, and I was content to let that realization come on its own, because when it did, it would not require explanation, it would not require argument, it would simply exist, undeniable. And as I sat there listening to her outline a future that would never unfold the way she imagined, I felt no urgency to correct her. No need to reveal anything prematurely, because the truth has a way of arriving at exactly the right moment, and I had already chosen when that moment would be. By the end of the week, the house had taken on a strange rhythm, one that moved around me instead of with me, as if Daniel and Jessica were already adjusting to a version of life where I no longer occupied the center of it, and I noticed how their conversations became more specific, more detailed, how they spoke less in suggestions and more in decisions, Jessica mentioning dates as if they were already confirmed, Daniel asking about logistics as if the outcome had been settled, and I allowed it to continue, not because I agreed, but because clarity often comes from letting people fully reveal their intentions without interruption. And that evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Jessica placed another document in front of me, this one more formal than the brochures, its tone more structured, its purpose more defined. This is just to make things easier, she said, her voice calm, practiced. It will help us manage everything while you transition. And I looked down at the paper, my eyes moving over the lines without reacting, recognizing immediately what it was, a form that would grant them control, access, authority, a step that would make everything they had been planning not only possible but effortless. And I rested my hand lightly on the table beside it, not touching the document itself, creating a small but deliberate distance, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, almost careful. It is just temporary, he said, as if reassurance could replace understanding, and I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because I could see the expectation in their posture, the subtle anticipation that this would be the moment I complied fully, the moment everything became official, and I let a few seconds pass, enough to make the silence noticeable but not uncomfortable, enough to shift the weight of the moment slightly back toward them, and then I lifted the paper, holding it just long enough to confirm what I already knew before placing it back down exactly where it had been, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table. I will need some time to review this, I said, my voice even, measured, leaving no room for urgency, and Jessica's expression flickered for just a second, a small disruption in her confidence, quickly replaced by a polite smile. Of course, she replied, though I could hear the adjustment in her tone, the recalibration of a plan that had expected immediate progress. And Daniel nodded again, more slowly this time, as if trying to reconcile my response with the outcome he had anticipated, and the conversation shifted after that, moving into safer territory, everyday topics that required no decisions, no tension. But the air had changed, subtly but unmistakably, because for the first time I had not simply absorbed what was presented to me, I had redirected it, gently but clearly. And later that night, when the house had quieted and their voices faded into the distance, I sat alone in the living room, the same place where so many conversations had once unfolded differently, and I allowed myself to reflect, not with regret, not with anger, but with a kind of calm evaluation, tracing the path that had led here, the small shifts, the gradual assumptions, the quiet ways in which control had been redefined without ever being explicitly discussed, and I realized that what they were doing now was not sudden. It was the natural extension of something that had been building for a long time, a pattern of decision making that had slowly moved me from participant to observer, and I had allowed it, not out of weakness, but out of trust, a trust that had not been questioned until now, and I stood then, moving to the window, looking out at the darkened street, the familiar outline of the neighborhood unchanged, steady, reliable, and I thought about the meeting I had scheduled, about the steps already in motion, about the difference between what they believed was happening and what was actually unfolding beneath the surface, and I felt no rush to accelerate anything, no need to confront them prematurely, because timing matters, not just what is done, but when it is revealed, and the next morning I followed through with that plan, dressing with the same quiet care, leaving the house without explanation, not because I was hiding anything, but because I did not owe them a narrative that had not yet reached its conclusion, and the drive to the attorney's office was calm, steady, the kind of drive that allows thoughts to settle into place, and when I arrived, the building itself was unremarkable, simple, professional, the kind of place where important things are handled without spectacle, and I sat across from the attorney, explaining everything once more, the brunch, the conversation, the document they had presented, and he listened carefully, asking questions that clarified rather than complicated. And when he spoke, his words were direct, grounded in fact, not assumption, confirming again what I already knew, that the house was mine, that no document they presented could change that without my consent, that any attempt to act otherwise would not hold, and I nodded, not surprised, but affirmed, because certainty, when reinforced, becomes something stronger than belief, it becomes foundation. And as we discussed the next steps, the options available, the protections already in place, I felt that same quiet control settle more firmly, not as something newly gained, but as something recognized, reclaimed, and when I left the office, stepping back into the afternoon light, I understood something with complete clarity. This was no longer about whether they would continue with their plans. They would, because they believed in them, but it was about how those plans would meet reality, and how that moment would unfold. And I walked back to my car with steady steps, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because I knew now that everything was already moving toward that point, and all that remained was to let it arrive. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was not quiet in the way it had been before. There was a different kind of energy in it, something more active, more certain, and I could hear voices before I even stepped fully inside, Jessica's voice clear and confident, layered with another voice I did not recognize at first, and as I moved further into the hallway I saw them in the living room. A man in a tailored suit standing near the window, holding a tablet, nodding as Jessica spoke, gesturing lightly toward the walls, the space, the structure of a house she was already treating as something to be evaluated rather than lived in, and Daniel stood nearby, listening, adding small comments, his posture more engaged than I had seen in weeks, and for a moment I paused, not out of surprise, but to observe, to take in the full picture without interrupting it, because there are moments when stepping into a scene too early alters its shape, and I wanted to see exactly how far they had gone, and Jessica noticed me first, her expression shifting only slightly before settling back into that same composed smile. "Oh, you are back," she said, as if my presence required acknowledgement but not adjustment. And the man turned then, offering a polite nod. "We were just discussing some possibilities," Jessica continued, her tone smooth, controlled. "This is Mark. He specializes in property evaluations." And I looked at him, taking in the details, the professional demeanor, the quiet confidence of someone used to walking through spaces and assigning them value, and I returned the nod. "I see," I said, my voice calm, my expression unchanged, and Daniel stepped forward slightly, as if to bridge something. "We thought it would be a good idea to understand what the house could be worth," he said, the words chosen carefully, but the intention clear, and I let a small pause settle between us, not long enough to create discomfort, but enough to give weight to what had just been said, and then I moved into the room fully, my steps measured, unhurried, the same way I had always moved through this house, and I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair near the table, grounding myself in something familiar. "And you decided to do this today," I said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Jessica smiled again, slightly brighter this time, as if framing the moment as proactive. "It is just preliminary," she said, "nothing final. just gathering information, and I nodded once, slowly, because the distinction she was making was not for me, it was for herself. A way to soften what had already crossed a line they had not acknowledged, and Mark began to speak then, explaining the process, the market, the potential, using terms that were neutral, professional, detached from the emotional weight the house carried for me, and I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing him to finish, because he was not the one making assumptions, he was responding to the information he had been given, and when he paused, waiting perhaps for a response, I met his gaze calmly. "Thank you for your time," I said, my tone polite, steady, and then I turned slightly toward Jessica and Daniel, my posture still relaxed, my expression composed. "I will need to see the documentation that authorizes this kind of evaluation," I added, the words simple, precise, and for the first time since I had walked into the room, there was a shift, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Jessica's smile held for a fraction too long before settling into something tighter, more controlled, and Daniel blinked, just once, as if recalibrating. "It is just an estimate," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, and I nodded again, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its implication. "Even so," I replied, "this house is not subject to evaluation without my consent," and I let the sentence rest there, not expanding on it, not explaining further, because clarity does not require elaboration when the foundation is solid, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not filled with assumption or expectation, it was filled with realization, the first small fracture in the narrative they had been building, and Mark shifted slightly, his professional instincts recognizing the change in dynamic. "Perhaps we should revisit this at another time," he said, his tone careful, neutral, and Jessica nodded quickly, recovering. "Yes, of course, we can reschedule," she said, though the ease in her voice had diminished, and I stepped back slightly, giving them space to conclude the interaction, because the moment had already done what it needed to do. It had introduced doubt, not loudly, not forcefully, but enough to disrupt the certainty they had been relying on, and as Mark gathered his things and moved toward the door, I walked with them, my presence steady, my expression unchanged, and when the door closed behind him, the house seemed to settle again, but not into silence, into awareness. And Jessica turned to me, her composure returning in measured layers. "We were only trying to plan ahead," she said, her voice controlled, carefully neutral, and I met her gaze, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present. "Planning requires clarity," I replied, my tone even, and Daniel shifted beside her, his posture no longer as certain as it had been earlier, and for a moment no one spoke, because something had changed, something small but irreversible, and I turned then, moving back into the living room, taking my seat as I had so many times before, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture relaxed, because this was not the moment for explanation, not yet. This was the moment for recognition, for them to begin seeing what they had overlooked, and I knew that this was only the beginning, not of conflict, but of understanding, and that understanding would continue to unfold whether they were ready for it or not. The house did not return to what it had been before that afternoon, even though everything on the surface appeared the same, the furniture unchanged, the routines continuing, the conversations resuming in quieter tones, but something had shifted beneath it all, something that could not be undone simply by speaking more carefully or avoiding certain topics, and I noticed it in the way Jessica moved through the rooms now, slightly more measured, as if recalculating each step, and in the way Daniel lingered in doorways a moment longer than usual, as if trying to understand something that had not been fully explained to him, and I allowed that uncertainty to grow, not feeding it, not resolving it, because uncertainty has a way of revealing truth more effectively than confrontation ever could. And that evening, as we sat at the dining table again, the same place where so many assumptions had been quietly reinforced, the atmosphere felt different, not tense, not openly strained, but aware, as if each of us understood that we were no longer operating within the same unspoken agreement, and Jessica spoke first, her tone softer than before. "We may have moved a little too quickly," she said, choosing her words with care, framing the situation as a matter of timing rather than authority, and I listened, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, allowing her to continue without interruption, because sometimes what is said after a shift matters more than what was said before it. And Daniel added something about wanting to make sure everyone was comfortable, his voice quieter, less certain, and I nodded once, acknowledging their words without accepting the premise behind them, because comfort had never been the issue, clarity had, and I reached for my glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it back down carefully, the simple motion grounding the moment, and then I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with the same steady tone I had maintained all along. "There are a few things we need to be clear about," I said, and both of them looked at me, not with the expectation they had carried before, but with something closer to attention, and I let a brief pause settle, not for effect, but for precision. "This house is not something that can be evaluated, transferred, or discussed in terms of sale without my direct authorization," I continued, the words measured, exact, leaving no room for interpretation, and Jessica's expression held, controlled but no longer entirely confident, and Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his posture reflecting the adjustment he was beginning to make, and I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because silence, when placed correctly, allows meaning to settle more deeply than explanation ever could. And after a moment Jessica spoke again, her voice still composed but with a trace of something new. "Beneath it, we thought we were helping," she said, and I looked at her, not unkindly, not accusingly, simply present. "Helping requires understanding the situation fully," I replied, and she nodded, slowly this time, as if recognizing that something essential had been overlooked, and Daniel exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to me, and I could see the shift in him more clearly now. Not complete, not resolved, but beginning, the first step away from assumption and toward recognition, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, maintaining the same calm presence that had guided me through every moment so far, because this was not about asserting control in a dramatic way, it was about restoring it in a way that could not be dismissed, and I continued, "I have already taken the necessary steps to ensure that everything regarding this property remains exactly as it is intended to be," I said, not elaborating, not listing details, simply stating the fact, and Jessica's eyes flickered for a brief moment, the implication settling in, and Daniel looked at me more directly now, searching perhaps for confirmation, for explanation, for something that would align with what he had believed before, and I offered none of it, not yet, because understanding is more powerful when it is reached, not handed over, and the rest of the meal passed quietly after that, not uncomfortable, but reflective, each of us sitting with what had been said, and what had not, and later that night, as the house settled once more into its familiar stillness, I walked through each room slowly, not out of sentiment, but out of awareness, taking in the details that had always been there, the placement of objects, the way the light shifted through the windows, the quiet stability of a space that had held my life for so many years, and I paused in the doorway of the living room, looking at the chair where I had sat earlier, the same place where everything had begun to change, and I understood then that the next step would not come from conversation alone, it would come from something more definitive, something that would not rely on interpretation or belief, something that would stand on its own, and I turned off the light, leaving the room in darkness for the night, because I knew that when morning came, the direction of everything would become even clearer, not just for me, but for them as well. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet clarity that did not need to announce itself, the light coming through the windows softer, steadier, as if even the house understood that something had reached its final point of alignment, and I moved through my routine with the same deliberate care, preparing my coffee, setting the cup down in its usual place, taking my seat at the dining table where so many conversations had unfolded, and I noticed that Daniel and Jessica were already there. Seated across from me, their posture different now, less certain, more attentive, as if they were waiting for something they could not quite define, and I allowed the silence to exist for a moment before I reached into the folder I had placed beside me, opening it slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, and I removed a set of documents, placing them carefully on the table between us, aligning them neatly, the edges straight, the presentation precise, because clarity deserves structure. And I looked at them both, my expression calm, my voice steady as I spoke. "I believe it is time we review the facts together," I said, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes moving to the papers, while Jessica remained still for just a fraction longer before shifting her gaze as well, and I slid the top document toward them, the deed, the one that had been signed years ago, the one that carried more weight now than it ever had before, and I watched as Daniel's eyes moved across the lines, his expression changing subtly, the certainty he had held beginning to unravel in quiet increments, and Jessica leaned in, her composure holding but tightening at the edges, and I gave them the space to read, not interrupting, not explaining, because the document spoke clearly on its own, and after a moment Daniel looked up, his voice lower now, more cautious. "This is in your name," he said, as if confirming something he had not expected to find, and I nodded once. "It always has been," I replied, my tone even, and Jessica's gaze remained on the paper for a moment longer before she lifted her eyes to meet mine, searching perhaps for context, for explanation, for something that would realign this with what she had believed, and I continued, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with the same steady clarity. This property is not subject to transfer, evaluation, or sale without my direct authorization, I said, the words measured, deliberate, and I placed another document beside the first, the trust, the structure that reinforced everything they were now beginning to understand, and Daniel exhaled quietly, leaning back in his chair, his posture shifting from certainty to recognition, and Jessica sat very still, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her expression controlled but no longer assured, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of realization, of recalibration, of the quiet collapse of a narrative that had been built without foundation, and I did not rush to fill it, because this moment was not about persuasion, it was about acknowledgement, and after a few seconds Daniel spoke again, his voice more tentative. We did not know, he said, and I looked at him, not with disappointment, not with judgment, simply with the clarity that had guided me through everything. That is exactly the point, I replied, and I let that settle, because understanding does not come from explanation alone, it comes from seeing where assumptions have replaced facts, and Jessica finally spoke, her tone carefully controlled. We were trying to plan for the future, she said, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting its premise. The future should not be planned on what does not belong to you, I answered, my voice calm, steady, and there was no sharpness in it, no raised volume, just truth stated plainly, and Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing the weight of that, and Jessica's expression shifted again, not defensive, not confrontational, but reflective, as if she were beginning to see the full scope of what had been overlooked, and I leaned back slightly, my hands resting in my lap, my posture relaxed, because there was nothing more to assert, nothing more to prove. The documents had already done that, and the room felt different now, not tense, not fractured, but grounded in something real, something that could not be reinterpreted or redirected, and after a moment I gathered the papers, not abruptly, but with the same care I had used when placing them down, returning them to the folder, closing it gently, because the purpose had been fulfilled, and I looked at them both, my expression unchanged, my voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. This house remains exactly as it is, I said, and I allowed a small pause before continuing, and so do I, and that was all, no further explanation, no extended discussion, because the moment did not require it, and as I stood, carrying the folder with me, leaving the table where everything had been redefined, I understood that what had been taken for granted was no longer invisible, and what had been assumed was no longer unchallenged, and as I moved through the house, the same house that had held every version of my life, I felt not a sense of victory, but of restoration, the quiet return of something that had never truly been lost, only overlooked, and behind me, the silence at the table remained, not empty, but full of the understanding that had finally, unmistakably, arrived.